United Nations headquarters, September 2025. The chambers of the Security Council once again became the scene of rising tensions between Russia, Ukraine, and the Western alliance. What began as a diplomatic session to address regional security swiftly escalated into a charged debate after multiple NATO members condemned Russia's latest wave of attacks and a serious breach of Polish airspace. The discussion captured both the urgency of the moment and the broader anxieties gripping Europe as the war enters yet another volatile phase. Diplomats gathered in New York to confront what several described as a dangerous new reality in Eastern Europe. Representatives noted that Russia's aggression, once largely confined to Ukrainian territory, has now spilled over into NATO space. For smaller European countries, the incursion was more than a technical violation. It was seen as an unmistakable provocation. A Slovenian representative opened with a stern warning about the pattern of Russian behavior. "We strongly condemn the escalation of Russian attacks against Ukraine," he said, pointing not only to the brutality inside Ukraine, but also to what he called a new and dangerous era of intimidation directed at the country's neighbours. Since the invasion of February 2022, Russian drones and missiles have occasionally brushed NATO airspace, but Slovenia underscored that this latest episode was different. Since 2022, we have seen repeated violations of the sovereign airspace of European states, but never on such a scale. Slovenia strongly condemns this incursion into Polish airspace. "It is unacceptable," the words resonated in the chamber, setting the tone for the debate. The Slovenian envoy sharpened his remarks, dismissing Russia's defence that the drone incursion was accidental. His statement was pointed and deliberate. "Such mistakes do not happen. They're no incident. They are aggressive and dangerous acts, as it is hard to imagine that so many drones flew so deep over Polish territory unintentionally." Around the table, several delegates nodded. The scepticism was shared. Few believed Moscow's denials. Instead, the incident was seen as part of a larger strategy of fear and destabilization. Slovenia did not mince words. "It is very hard not to look at this incident as yet another tactic of terror." By emphasizing that the breach was not an accident, Slovenia drew a red line. For countries on NATO's eastern flank, the fear is not simply about airspace, but about the precedent such actions set. Once violations are tolerated, escalation becomes easier. The United States delegation quickly reinforced Slovenia's line, echoing NATO's collective defense principle. The American representative reassured allies that Washington's commitment was ironclad. "The United States stands by our NATO allies in the face of these alarming airspace violations," the delegate declared. The US confirmed that consultations with Poland were already underway under Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. These talks allow allies to meet whenever one feels its security is threatened. The message was unmistakable. Washington was preparing to coordinate a collective response. And rest assured, we will defend every inch of NATO territory. But the American statement also carried frustration. US officials had spent weeks attempting to mediate peace. The so-called Alaska summit between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin on August 15th had aimed to de-escalate the war. Yet instead of restraint, Russia intensified its bombing campaign. Civilian casualties and infrastructure damage mounted. The American envoy reminded the chamber of the stakes. These actions, now with the addition of violating the airspace of a US ally, intentionally or otherwise, show immense disrespect for good faith US efforts to bring an end to this conflict. The delegate urged Moscow to reverse course. "We urge Russia to renew and live up to its commitment to diplomacy by seeking an immediate end to hostilities through direct negotiations with Ukraine." For Washington, the incident symbolized the fragility of diplomacy. What had been framed as potential dialogue weeks earlier was now at risk of collapsing under the weight of continued violence. If Slovenia and the United States expressed concern, Poland delivered fury. The Polish Secretary of State took the floor, visibly resolute. For Warsaw, this was not just another violation, it was a direct attack on its sovereignty. He began by contextualizing the moment. Such incidents happened before, but this time we know that that was the first time since the beginning of Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine in 2022 that Polish territorial integrity has been purposely violated on such an unprecedented scale. His next words cut through the chamber. "We know, and I repeat, we know that it was not a mistake." The Polish delegation described how drones had been intercepted before they could strike civilian areas. In one case, a drone targeted the small village of Weriki in eastern Poland. The incident was proof, Warsaw argued, that Russia was extending its campaign of terror across borders. Drones are instruments of terror that have shattered homes and communities across Ukraine. 2 days ago, they tried to target Polish homes. To underline the claim, Poland presented physical evidence, debris with Russian markings. Moscow's denial that the drones were theirs, Warsaw insisted, was implausible. The statement carried defiance as well as alarm. Poland will not be intimidated. Our resolve to stand with Ukraine and defend the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity remains unwavering. The Polish intervention struck a chord. For many NATO members, Poland has become the symbolic frontline state, bearing the brunt of refugee flows, facing drone intrusions, and absorbing the economic fallout of the war. Warsaw's blunt rhetoric reflected not only national anger, but also the collective anxiety of Europe's eastern flank. The unease in the chamber was palpable. Diplomats understood that if Russia's drones could strike Polish villages, they could strike elsewhere too, Romania, Slovakia, or even Germany. The war was no longer neatly contained within Ukraine's borders. Though Russia's representative had attempted to deny responsibility, the response from European delegations was overwhelmingly sceptical. The chamber weighed not just the technical aspects of air defence, but also the political strategy at play. Was Moscow deliberately testing NATO's resolve, or was it trying to intimidate populations into pushing their governments toward compromise? For Western diplomats, the conclusion leaned toward the first option. They pointed to patterns, deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, cyber attacks across Europe, and now drone incursions. Each was seen as part of a wider Russian toolkit of hybrid warfare. Despite the heated rhetoric, there was also a shared acknowledgement escalation into a NATO-Russia conflict would be catastrophic. Both the Slovenian and American delegates stressed the need for renewed diplomacy. The Russia-Ukraine war needs to end. We cannot risk it escalating into a broader conflict. Russia must demonstrate its seriousness by taking immediate concrete steps toward peace. Yet optimism was scarce. With each passing week, bombs fell heavier on Ukrainian cities, and Russia showed little appetite for compromise. For NATO, the balance was precarious: deter aggression without tipping into direct war. The Security Council debate underscored the multiple layers of the crisis. For Ukraine, the challenge remains sheer survival under relentless bombardment. For Poland and its neighbours, the question is sovereignty and security in the face of Russian intimidation. For the United States, it is credibility, both as a global power and as NATO's cornerstone. And for the world, it is the haunting possibility of escalation into something larger, perhaps uncontrollable. The Polish Secretary of State's words lingered longest in the chamber. They encapsulated both anger and determination. We know, and I repeat, we know that it was not a mistake. As diplomats filed out, the atmosphere was heavy with recognition. Europe had entered a new stage of the war. The boundary between Ukraine and NATO was being tested, and the world's ability to contain the conflict was now more uncertain than ever.
Incident does not help the extraordinary efforts that the United States has undertaken in recent weeks to broker an end to the war. Since the Alaska summit between President Trump and President Putin on August 15th, Russia has intensified its bombing campaign against Ukraine, resulting in loss of life and damage to civilian infrastructure. These actions, now with the addition of violating the airspace of a U.S. ally, intentionally or otherwise, show immense disrespect for good faith U.S. efforts to bring an